All right, welcome everybody. Lovely to see you today. Happy Thursday. We made it through all the Jewish fall holidays here, and we have a stretch of no Chag for quite a while now. But we are still in Tractate Zevachim. And so we continue forward there. I'm Rachel Scheiderman, and at My Jewish Learning and Daily Dose Talmud, I get to host these classes on Thursday mornings, where we review some highlights from the pages we studied in Daf Yomi this week. And this morning, we're delighted to welcome Rabbi Lexie Botzum to do just that.
Hello, everyone. Great to see you again. So we pick up this week, right? We have the midst of this discussion, the beginning of our dapim for the past week, or a somewhat absurd scenario of what happens when an animal, some of its legs are inside of the temple courtyard and some of it is out. And these incredibly sort of intricate, fine-grained questions of what happens if you cut off the animal's legs and slaughtered it, or slaughtered it and they cut off its legs. Would that count as it not being outside of the temple courtyard? And then we got to even more elaborate scenarios, including Shmuel's father quizzing him on what would happen if the animal was suspended from the ground, or what would happen if the priest was suspended from the ground while collecting the animal's blood. And it turns out that actually in a lot of these scenarios, it would be kosher, but the priest being suspended would not, because that is not a normal form of service, as it were, to be, I guess, flying suspended through the air while collecting blood. And we get this new Mishnah about what happens if the blood, while it's being sprinkled, is placed on the wrong parts of the ramp or the altar, right? So it's sprinkled, but it's sprinkled sort of either above the line when it's supposed to be below, or vice versa. And it said that the offering is pasul, is disqualified, but that there's no karet for eating it. And this prompted this whole sort of debate as to the meaning of pasul, or disqualified, in this Mishnah. Shmuel takes a sort of non-intuitive approach to the term and says that even though pasul usually means completely disqualified, here it means that it's not edible, right? You can't eat the sacrifice, but it still has affected atonement for the owner, right? And he proves this from the fact that elsewhere it seems like the wrong placement of blood doesn't disqualify an offering fundamentally, right? And so he has to then go and explain a lot of other contradictions with other sources. You have Reish Lakish, who agrees with him that misplacement of blood doesn't disqualify an offering, but our Mishnah is referring to somebody who had improper intent and it was actually disqualified. You have Rabbi Yochanan, the famous disputant of Reish Lakish, who says, no, in every scenario, improper placement of the blood is something that would in fact fully disqualify an offering. It's not only inedible, but it does not, have whatever impact it was intended to have, including atoning for its owner, right? And so we get into this whole intricate discussion about this question of the placement of blood and how that maps onto our Mishnayot. And then also a question of in which cases are disqualified sacrifices that have been brought to an altar removed from the altar, and in which cases are they nonetheless sacrificed on the altar, right? The Gemara uses this language of bringing up and bringing down, but the idea is that there are certain sacrifices that even if disqualified, they've sort of been sanctified by the altar such that you can't remove them, right? You still have to sacrifice them. It's just that they won't be effective for their purpose, and again, cannot be consumed by the Kohanim or the owners. And then a huge chunk of our Gemara from this past week is about pigul, right? This is the concept of a sacrifice where the owner, while sacrificing it, had the intent to consume it after the time in which it is permitted to consume it. That intent while performing the slaughter and sacrifice of this animal renders it pigul, and that afterwards anybody who consumes of it receives karet, right? An incredibly heavy punishment of spiritual excision. And so the Mishnah sort of parses out the distinction between intent about place, right? So the intent to eat the sacrifice in the wrong location being something that disqualifies the sacrifice, but does not render it pigul. You would not get karet, right, for eating the sacrifice in that scenario. It is only intent around time, right? The intent around eating a sacrifice at the wrong time that sort of accomplishes this metaphysical switch in the sacrifice's status. And the Gemara goes through an incredibly elaborate discussion about how do we derive that principle, right? Like what is our read of these different psukim that arrives at the idea that it's only time that matters with regard to the rules of pigul. We also get this sort of derivation of this rule itself as being about intent rather than consumption, right? Because in the pasuk, in the verses themselves, it at first glance seems to imply that it's just saying if somebody eats a sacrifice after it's been disqualified, right, on the third day, then the sacrifice is not accepted, right? But some of the rabbis say that doesn't really make sense because then we're having this sort of retroactive process where like a sacrifice was effective and then you eat it 2 days later or 2.5 days later, and suddenly retroactively it's canceled, right? And so there's a lot of different derivations, but they all end up arguing that pigul is not about the act of eating, it's about the intent during the sacrifice itself, right? And so, having established how we get this rule, a new Mishnah also elaborates on some of the requirements for something to be rendered pigul, right? So, we have the idea it must be intent about eating with regard to something that is usually eaten, or intent about burning with regard to something that is usually burned. It has to be about an amount of the sacrifice that is at least a kazait, right? An olive bulk, which is a sort of minimum significant measurement for a lot of things. Um, and it has to be during the slaughtering or the collecting of blood or its conveying or sprinkling, right? And if somebody does any of these actions with intent about wrong location, even if they also had another action where they were intending to eat the sacrifice at the wrong time, according to the rabbis, those sort of jumble together and it's not rendered pigul, right? Whereas Rabbi Yehuda, and this is what the Gemara plays out, thinks that if the intent to eat the sacrifice at the wrong time preceded the intent to eat it in the wrong place, it is rendered pigul, right? And that latter intent doesn't go back and disqualify or, cancel out, as it were, the original one, which leads to the Gemara just getting into a really, really intricate discussion about in all sorts of scenarios, when do things combine, right? When do intents combine? When do measurements combine? How overlapping do different kind of thoughts and actions need to be for us to say that they are considered simultaneous versus to treat them as sequential? Um, and again, we have questions about the specific phrasing of the olive bulks and what that means about whether they can combine in different orders, right? But that's a huge focus of the end of our last chapter, this question of like, in what scenarios can both thoughts and physical measurements be sort of jumbled together versus when do we treat them as distinct? And then finally, we started a new chapter yesterday, and this is what we'll also be looking at today, where the Mishnah at the beginning of our new chapter introduced the idea that everybody is kosher to shecht, to sacrifice an animal, to slaughter an animal. And therefore, because everybody is kosher to slaughter an animal, if they had improper intent while doing so, they're able to render it pigul. So everyone here includes women, children, slaves, non-Jews, like running the full gamut, as opposed to most of the other sort of services, which can only be performed by a male priest. And then the thing that we're going to look at today is the Gemara sort of unpacking what the status of that permission is, right? How much is this like an absolute permission for anybody to shecht versus how much is this a sort of qualified one? So I'm gonna share a link to this Safari sheet in the comments. So just taking a look first, I see someone mentioned getting back into Daf Yomi after 6 months. Jumping back into sacrifices is jumping into the middle of Zevachim is a very intense place to pick up. So shkoyach to you. I will say, for those who are saying that this tractate is confusing, I do think that Kodshim is arguably like the Seder that we're in, arguably the most confusing on the whole of the Seders of the Gemara, especially since it is again dealing with topics that most of us haven't encountered elsewhere because they are no longer Lamaisa acted out rules or scenarios. This is all ultimately for us now theoretical, and so it can be incredibly sort of intricate, seemingly formalist discussions to us. So if you are finding it confusing, that is you are not alone in that respect.
Great. And the other
But
problem is they don't start at the beginning. They start with edge cases and exceptions and right, there's no like, well, here's how a sacrifice works. Let's tell you the basics first, right? They assume you know that and then they jump right in. And so I think as with as with so many aspects of the Talmud, we just kind of we swim in and we pick up what we can and we understand that the learning is going to be circular and we're going to pick up what we can today and more tomorrow and it will slowly come and make more sense as we go. That's my pep
no,
talk. Sorry to
it's
interrupt. Thank you for this source sheet.
yeah, I think it's a very useful point, which is also, to be clear, I think important to remember with any of our tractates that the rabbis don't really proceed in order because they're already functioning from the assumption that you know all of the rest of that Gemara and those rules. And so they'll often plunge you something that like you might have thought, the way we often relate to books and sources and things, that the first chapter, that things progress chronologically. But that is unfortunately not how almost any of the Gemara or even Mishnah generally proceeds. And so hopefully by the end of Seder Kodshim, we'll be feeling much more confident because all these laws will have, jumbled and finally been reordered in our minds. But yeah, so I shared the link to this Varya sheet above, but I'm also going to share my screen. Um, so one moment. Okay. So this was our Mishnah, right, from yesterday's Gemara, the beginning of our new chapter. So it says, Kol hapsunin sheshachatu shchitatan kshera, sheshchita kshera bezarim ubenashim uba'avadim ub'tmeim. So any priests who are unfit for temple service, if they slaughtered an offering, it is valid because shechita is also kosher with regard to non-priests, with regards to women, with regards to slaves, with regards to the impure, va'afilu bekodesh kodeshim, and even with like regard to the most sacred offerings. Ubilvan shelo yutz me'im nog'in bebasar, provided that the impure do not touch the flesh of the animal, because that would transmit impurity. Lefichach hen poslin b'machshava. Therefore, since all of these people are kosher to slaughter, if they have sort of improper intent while slaughtering, it can disqualify the offering. So I also see people talking about the notions of the rabbis making the priesthood impossible. There are a lot of discussions, and we can continue examining this throughout the tractate about the rabbis, the sort of Mishnah and Gemara as something of a power struggle, or if not struggle, almost like assertion of different methods of authority of the rabbis, both trying to actually play out in some meaningful capacities how the temple service worked, and also trying to kind of restructure it in their own image or to, have an image of the priesthood that accorded with their current leadership. So it's an important note to have in the back of our minds, right? That like having a critical eye towards like what is the sort of goal, right? Like the pedagogical goal, the political goal, etc., of the people who are producing our material. Okay, so we had this Mishnah, right? It said the people who are, right, so for example, a priest who hasn't immersed, or a priest who has a blemish, or things like that, or who's like not wearing the right garments, or any scenario like that, they are kosher if they slaughtered. Their slaughtering is kosher because slaughtering can be formed by all of these non-priests and non-men and non-Jews. But now the Gemara sort of picks up on an intricacy of the language used here, right? It says shachatu, right? It says those who slaughtered, diavadin lechatchila lo. That implies that after the fact, if they slaughtered an animal, it's kosher. But lechatchila, right, from the get-go, no, they shouldn't, right? That this is like a really sort of precise read of the language that we see in multiple places in the Gemara, right? Where if it says someone who did blank, it is kosher or it has this impact, the rabbis often read into that, oh, if it was done, that's the ruling. But there's a different language that it would use if it wanted to teach us that lichatchila, it's totally allowed to do that. So this would seem to imply that the disqualified priests and potentially all the other people, if they slaughtered, it's kosher, but they shouldn't, right? Like you shouldn't choose to let them do that. But now the Gemara raises a contradiction. Uraminhu, Vishachat, Shchita Bazar Kshira, Shashchita Kshira Bazarim, Ubenashim, Ubabadim, Ubitmeim, Vafila Bekoche Kodshim. Right, so the Gemara raises a contradiction. So we have this verse that says, and he shall slaughter the bull before the Lord. And from the fact that it just says, he shall slaughter, and unlike in some of our other verses, does not mention the priesthood explicitly, teaches that the slaughter is valid if performed by a non-priest. As our Mishnah states, slaughter is valid when performed by non-priests, women, slaves, and the ritually impure, even with regard to the most sacred offerings. And now we have a classic sort of structure of midrash halacha, right? Of how the sort of midrash that derives rulings from our verses is often structured. It says, "O eno ela b'kohanim." Perhaps it actually is only kosher for priests. Amarta, v'chim ayin bata, miklal shene'emar, v'ata u'vanecha itcha tishmeru et kunatchem l'chol davar hamizbeach. Why might I say that it's only kosher for priests? Well, because there's this pasuk that says, you and your children with you will guard your priesthood for all matters of the altar. Yichol af b'shlita. Could it be that that applies even to slaughter? Talmud lomar, v'shachat et ben habakar lifnei Adonai v'hikrivo v'gomer. The pasuk says, confusingly, when the Gemara is referring in this Midrash Halakha to a verse, it says Talmud Lomar. That is not referring to the Talmud as we know it, but in fact means that the Torah says. The Torah says, and he shall slaughter the child of the bull, and before Hashem will offer it. Mikabala ve'elach mitzvat kahuna. Nimed al shchita shekshera b'chol adam. Right? So it doesn't actually quote the full part of that verse, but the full verse says, he shall slaughter the bull before the Lord, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall present the blood. Right? And so the Midrash learns out from that, from the collection of the blood onward, it has to be performed by the priests. Right? But before that, it's kosher for anybody. Right? And so this is where the Gemara is drawing on a contradiction, because from the fact that it says, Hashchita kshera b'chol adam, right? It is kosher with regard to anyone. That sort of language implies lichatchila. Anyone can do it, right? Not that ideally it should be performed by priests, but if it's performed by somebody else, we can work with it. That implies just, completely unqualified. Anybody is able to do this, and it's okay, right? And so the Gemara now concedes the point. It says, Hu hadin afilu lichatchila nami. It is true, actually, that all of these other people could slaughter lichatchila, right? That women and non-Jews and the unfit priests, all of these people, lichatchila would be allowed to slaughter an animal. But so why do we teach it the way we do? Mishum dekabai lemitnat tmeim de lichatchila lo gzera shema yikub basar tana shachatu. It used the sort of b'diavad after the fact language of who slaughtered, because it was teaching also about the case of a ritually impure person, whereas the women and the slaves and the non-Jews, all and the otherwise disqualified priests, all of them are lichatchila from the get-go allowed to slaughter. The impure person is not lichatchila allowed to slaughter because we are concerned there is a sort of a gzera, a rabbinic decree, lest they touch the animal itself and therefore disqualify it by passing on their impurity, right? So we're saying that an impure person who slaughtered an animal, if they didn't touch the animal directly, that's also kosher, right? But they are the only ones on our list who lichatchila are not allowed to do so because we are worried it would be very easy for them to accidentally come in contact with the animal. But now the Gemara even questions this ruling. It says, V'tamei diavad shapir dami. Is it really true that the impure person, after the fact, it actually is okay if they slaughtered? V'raminhu v'samach v'shachat masmicha b'torim afshrita b'torim. Well, we're going to raise a contradiction. It juxtaposes the laying of the hands on a sacrifice and the slaughtering. And we say just as smicha, right, the laying of the hands must be with pure individuals, So too, shlita, the slaughtering must be with pure individuals. That would seemingly imply that even after the fact, it shouldn't work. The Gemara answers, midrabanan, right? By rabbinic law. On a Torah law, if an impure person slaughtered a sacrifice, it is kosher. On a rabbinic level, the rabbis deemed it unfit in order to prevent the scenario where they actually touch the flesh and render it invalid. Right? So this is one of our classic examples of sort of rabbinic fences around the law, as it were, which also does seem to contradict our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah just seems to imply that at least b'diavad, after the fact, if an impure person slaughtered the animal, it would be kosher, right? This is the Mishnah is a rabbinic source. The Mishnah seems to imply even rabbinically that would be okay. But due to other sources the Gemara is engaging with, we end up with this idea that the impure priest or non-priest who slaughters, after the fact, on a rabbinic level, the sacrifice would not be acceptable. Okay, we're going to pause here. We're going to look at some other, at least one other fun source. But before we go on, see what if folks had thoughts on this Mishnah, if the ruling surprised them at all, both the ruling in the Mishnah and the question about the chachila, I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts. They say if the lifeblood needs to be gathered by the priest, how can anyone else do the slaughter? Well, they're both there, right? Somebody is doing the shechting, right? Is like severing the simanim, the relevant parts of the animal's neck. And then a priest is there to like, press the vessel up against the animal's neck, right? Obviously, you would need to have a priest around because if a priest isn't like present at the time, then it's true that the lifeblood would like seemingly fall onto the floor. And as we've seen, if it goes directly to the floor, that's not kosher. But the way you can have it is you could just have a non-priest who slaughters, and the priest is there waiting to collect the blood after the animal is slaughtered. Yeah, book called Purity and Danger. Yes, lots of things about purity and ritual that will continue to be coming up throughout Seder Kodshim. As people have already seen, the question of being pure or impure with regards to the Beit HaMikdash and the temple is an incredibly intricate topic that comes up quite a lot. Somebody says, if someone who is not an expert attempts to slaughter an animal, does so ineptly without quickly bleeding it and killing it, would they have wound up with a living injured animal that would therefore be considered blemished? Yes. If you attempted to slaughter an animal and failed, you would in fact have blemished the animal such that that animal would no longer be kosher to offer. So that is obviously a concern, and actually that is a great lead in to our next sources, right? That like it is true that if you did not correctly shecht an animal, it would be ruined, as it were. You can no longer, it both would probably be a treifa, such that it wouldn't even be kosher to eat, like in modern days, if you tried to shecht it again, and that it wouldn't be kosher to offer as a sacrifice, right? So people might have noticed when it comes to, I was just talking about how Seder Kodshim is mostly not applicable to modern day, but Shlita actually is, right? Like Shlita is still something that is applicable when it comes to like consuming kosher food. And people may acknowledge that the vast majority of shochtim, the vast majority of slaughterers are men. Why is that, given the ruling in our Mishnah? Sorry, the Tosfot here, right, who are medieval rabbis, mostly in France. So they comment on this. Shashchita ksherah b'nashim. Slaughter is kosher by women, quoting from our Mishnah. B'Gemara muchach denashim shochtot afilu lechatchila. In the Gemara, it proves that women can slaughter even, from the get-go, ab initio. Haditnan sheshachtu diavad, mishum debai lemitnei tmeim delechatchila lo. The loka amar mishum debai lemitnei nashim, diktane beresha. From the fact that it said, the reason it said sheshachtu, who slaughtered, using after the fact language, that was because of the impure people who lechatchila are not allowed to slaughter. But it didn't say that we teach sheshachtu, this after the fact language, in order to teach that women cannot lechatchila slaughter. And now I apologize, I don't have this written out in English, but I will write it up. So if anyone wants to look at the source sheet, you will have this as a reference point. Mikan tshuva l'mashe katvu behilchot Eretz Yisrael. Nashim lo yishchatu mifnei shedatan kala. From here, there is an answer to that which was written in the Hilchot Eretz Yisrael, some document of laws from those in Mandatory Palestine, where it said women should not slaughter because their minds are light, or their disposition is light. V'od katuv behen shachat v'lo berech va'arum sheshachat shrita psula. It also wrote in those laws that somebody who shechted and didn't make the blessing, or someone who was naked and shechted, their shchita is disqualified. V'nireh shehem chumrot ba'alma, shayomer oto chacham shekatav hilchot Eretz Yisrael. The Tosfot are like, those seem to be mere chumrot, mere stringencies that the guy who wrote those halachot decided to include, right? But the Tosfot here are saying those don't actually have any meaningful halachic bearings, right? They're saying here very confidently that no, our Mishnah and our Gemara explicitly say that lechatchila women can shecht. That's the conclusion, and this guy just had a different idea and he wanted to be stringent, but that's not the conclusion of our Gemara. But much later, we're unfortunately not going to get through all of this. The Aruch HaShulchan, if you jump a number of centuries in advance, he's in the late 19th century. And he's saying, Kavar nitzba'er shakol kshem shlita. We've already explained, everybody is kosher to shecht, afilu nashim ba'avadim, even women and slaves. V'yesh omrim she'en lahaniach nashim lishkot, shekvar nahagu shelo lishkot. Some say we shouldn't let women shecht because we've already had the practice of them not shechting, right? Since it's been the norm of that not happening, we shouldn't change that. Even though we have this principle of saying just because we haven't seen something is not proof that it's not possible. Maybe in a matter like this, which is so common, where people are shechting all the time, and we say women never shecht, maybe that is sort of proof. And he goes on to say, yeah, it is the common practice that women don't shecht. And, he goes on to try and sort of explain why might this be. And he sort of tries to explain the datan kalot, their minds are light, in a ever so slightly less offensive way, but still obviously very stereotypical, where we have this concern about people who pass out while shechting, right? The Gemara is like concerned about people who will like see blood and pass out. And he's like, well, maybe their like disposition is more like delicate, such that we're more worried that women might pass out while shechting, right? Or going back to the comment someone made about if somebody is not expert, he says, we're also maybe like the matters like shlita, which requires so much expertise. Maybe we don't like trust that most women have the sufficient expertise to do it. And so even though technically if they do it correctly, it's kosher, we basically don't trust their knowledge and their expertise such that we'll allow it l'chachila. Now, this is one of many things, which again, if you're in a world in which women have access to the same level of education, would no longer be applicable. So there are actually several people who are training women to be shochtot nowadays. So there are not only men shochtim out there at this point in time, but it's a really interesting development where we see this explicit ruling in the Mishnah and Gemara saying, yeah, it's totally fine for women to shecht. And then we get this sociological development over time where nonetheless people end up not letting women do it because an undervaluation of women's abilities means that they don't really trust women with this really important sort of ritual role. Yes, but women were midwives, right? Women, again, the idea, they're so delicate and they might just pass out when seeing blood. Probably saw much more blood than most men who were not shochtim, but apparently that was not on the Aruch HaShulchan's mind. Someone talks about the impurity. So being impure wouldn't be an issue for slaughtering for non-temple purposes, right? That the issue of impurity is only relevant when you're slaughtering for a sacrifice, right? But when we're in like non-temple times, when shechting like an animal to be consumed, it's totally fine if you're impure, right? We're allowed to eat impure things. You're just not allowed to offer impure things. So the fact that, women or people who menstruate are going to be more commonly impure would not be relevant for food purposes. But yes, I would say the notion that women more likely to pass out, perhaps not so accurate, but that was one of their prevailing assumptions. Any final comments before we close it out for today? Also, yes, somebody noted post-temple we're all impure. That is the prevailing assumption, is that nowadays, like there's so many causes of impurity that we're constantly coming into contact with that nobody is really in the presumption of purity other than immediately after you emerge from the mikveh. Julius?
I just want to say basically, this is really interesting how this whole Gemara talks about the sacrifices and who can offer them and who can't. How can I say this? I believe this whole thing is talking about how to draw closer to God. And it's really interesting. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, definitely korbanot sacrifices are envisioned as one of the most visceral ways of us both petitioning God and again, like building our relationship with God. That's already very explicit in Tanakh and is, only built upon in the Gemara. And I think there are a lot of these questions that Seder Kochim engages with, which is like, what does it mean for there to be intermediaries in that process versus for you to have some measure of like direct connection, right? That in many capacities, we have the priests as our kind of intermediary for this really vital function. And like, what does that say about our questions of kind of sanctity and purity and whether people are able to have equally direct connections with Hashem? I think that that's like a really big question underlying this entire section of the Mishnah and Gemara. Yeah.
All right, I think we will leave it there. Thank you, everybody who stumbled out of so many holidays to come learn Talmud with us today. Lovely to see you all. Wish you a good week, a Shabbat Shalom. No Chag between next Thursday, and we will see you then. Thank you, Rabbi Botzum. Bye.
Bye.